All right, today we're doing one of my favorite things. We're combining geography with astrology, two of my favorite kind of passions and subjects. And I thought it would be especially interesting to cover the chart of California. California is a state with a long and rich history. Dramatically different phases have gone on in California. So let's get into it. I'm really excited to look at this chart. So I'm using kind of the standard chart for California. This is on astrotheme.com, and we're using Monday, September 9th, 1850 at 9:32 a.m. in San Jose, California. And fun fact, September 9th is the most common birth date. I heard that somewhere. So it's not entirely unlikely that you might have a birthday around California's birthday. What's interesting though to me is that I've actually looked at the charts. Well, I haven't looked at the charts of every US state, but I've at least seen the like birth date, so to speak, the date that each state started. And I know that California is the only Virgo state, which I find pretty interesting. There's a lot of Geminis, a lot of Cancers for whatever reason. I'm not sure if there's a reason behind that, but only one Virgo state, and that's California. And that was pretty surprising to me because, Virgo's a pretty modest and kind of understated sign. California as a state seems pretty extreme. It seems like it has, a pretty intense reputation, right? Like everybody knows about California, regardless of where you are in the world. So for it to be not just a Virgo, but the only Virgo state, to me was very surprising. And before we get into the chart, I would just say that what I would expect from this chart would be a chart of extremes. Because, like I was just saying, we know California as a very prominent state, a very like a state with an intense reputation. Let's just put it that way. Like it has the most population, it has the most electoral votes because of that population. So it's a very influential state, not just politically, but obviously it's been a source of kind of culture and entertainment and television. There's a lot of money in California. Historically, there were, well, real quick about the history, and then I promise I'll get into the astrology very soon. But my very loose understanding of California history is that for the first part of its kind of involvement being a U.S. state, there wasn't a whole lot going on in California. It was kind of in the hinterlands. It was way out west. Not a lot of people had gone out there yet. At the time of California's statehood in 1850, the whole kind of gold rush and moving out west was just barely starting. So it was only once gold was discovered in California and then later oil was discovered there, then it became kind of a hot spot. People started coming out in droves. Then it also took time for it to become the agricultural powerhouse that it is today. So it took some time. Like originally it was, I don't want to say a wasteland. I'm sure it was very beautiful, but at least like in economic terms, there wasn't anything going on there. It was only later that it kind of developed more into what we know it today. Then Hollywood became a thing, and then so it's really interesting. Like I said, it's had a history that's evolved quite a bit and is continuing to evolve today. So what I would expect from the chart is a chart of extremes and a chart of different kind of influences or energies kind of battling in the chart, if that makes sense. And pulling up the chart here, I would say you can definitely see that this is the case. I do definitely see a very prominent reputation. Yes, Sun is in Virgo, which is not the most like reputable sign. Virgo is usually more comfortable behind the scenes. Virgo's usually more modest or humble, which again is kind of surprising. We wouldn't associate that like humility or that self-deprecation kind of Virgo energy. We wouldn't associate that with California. Really, I would think of the opposite. I would think of like maybe a lot of Jupiter or something. But it does make sense that Sun is in the 11th house, and also we have Leo midheaven as well. So combining Sun in the 11th house with Leo midheaven, that would suggest this is a state that does get a lot of attention. It naturally kind of takes up the spotlight. Also, kind of just looking at some of these basic placements, Moon and Ascendant and Venus, for that matter, are all in Scorpio. So we can see that this is a very scorpionic state. Other than Scorpio, there's also a lot going on in Libra. There's, well, technically just a Mercury Mars conjunction in Libra, but still having two inner planets in Libra is a big deal. It's also very interesting that at the time of this chart, Venus had just barely entered Scorpio, Moon had just barely entered Scorpio, and Jupiter was just about to leave Virgo and enter Libra. So, in other words, it's really close to having one or two or three more planets. Well, not three more, one or two. It's close to having one or two more planets in Libra, but not quite. But anyway, so to focus on the chart again, um, it is interesting. Not just Sun, but also Jupiter are in 11th house Virgo, and so that's interesting because again, it's kind of a contradiction, right? Sun and Jupiter in Virgo are a little bit out of place, particularly Jupiter, which is in detriment in Virgo. So if we just looked at Sun and Jupiter in Virgo, that would suggest someone that is, they have to work very hard for any kind of success that they have. They don't just naturally inherit anything. They have to like work hard, and they may overanalyze things quite a bit. It's a very, like I said, kind of intellectual and sort of self-deprecating energy. But the fact that Sun and Jupiter are in the 11th house means that, like, yes, what I just said is true to some extent, but at the same time, this is a state that does naturally shine in the spotlight, especially, again, combining midheaven and Leo with Sun and Jupiter in the 11th house. Looking at these Scorpio placements, this is also super interesting, and it's kind of another contradiction. So, having kind of a triple conjunction here between Moon, Venus, and the Ascendant, all three of these are pretty tightly conjunct. Moon and Ascendant are both at 3 degrees Scorpio, with Venus at 1 degree Scorpio. So having all these three conjunct is a contradiction. So I'll give you both sides here. On the one hand, having Moon and Venus and the Ascendant all conjunct would suggest, for a state, this would suggest, a region that comes across very well. It has a really high reputation, and it's known for its soulfulness. There's passion there, there's emotion, especially in a water sign like Scorpio. And that makes sense, right? That makes sense from what we know about California. There's a lot of like music there, for example, or artistry. Venus and the Moon are both the most kind of feminine planets, so they're all about, look within and be receptive. It also makes sense. California is kind of a hot spot for like new age, theories and spirituality and things like that. So that makes a lot of sense with Moon and Venus conjunct the Ascendant. Tap into that kind of feminine energy and the yin energy, tap into nature, or, be observant to cycles. And I'm almost picturing like high priestess energy, if that makes sense. Just being very intuitive and one with nature and all of that. And again, there's also a lot of charisma and charm here as well. Moon adds that kind of emotional element, which can be very persuasive, very captivating for sure. It can kind of tap into like fantasy and indulgence, even like hedonism to some extent. And then same with Venus there as well. Venus is also kind of a hedonistic planet. But Venus definitely bolsters that kind of charm, the charisma. It shows that this state projects an image of opulence, of wealth. And I know some of what I'm going to say might be sound contradictory or might be debatable, but there's still definitely a lot of money in California. We can at least agree on that. So that makes sense with, Venus conjunct the Ascendant. This is a state that has to do with money, finances, success, and appearances, making a good appearance, making a strong appearance. So I know I said I was going to give you two sides, and I kind of trailed off. So one side is that really, coming across very feminine, but also very charming and seductive, and maybe a bit hedonistic. On the other hand, both Venus and the Moon are very out of place here. So it's kind of like, which one is it? Are Venus and the Moon very strong because they're conjunct the Ascendant and they're being highlighted? Or are they very weak because Moon is in fall in Scorpio and Venus is in detriment in Scorpio? Both are true. So in other words, this is a state that does come across very well, charming, seductive, hedonistic, artistic, spiritual. But it does all of those things in a very counterculture way. It does all of those things in a very unexpected way, which again kind of makes sense, if you think about California's history. Let's see. So yeah, both these planets being debilitated, any kind of debilitated placements always suggest a misunderstanding. Other people, again, it's contradictory. Like, the state comes across very well and seems to be very well understood by people all around the world, yet at the same time it's deeply misunderstood, and there could be a lot of secrecy there as well, which is kind of characteristic of Scorpio placements. Another thing too is that femininity that I talked about from, the two most feminine planets being on the ascendant. That is there, but at the same time, even that femininity is kind of coming from an obscure place, or it's coming in an unexpected way, because Scorpio is not the most feminine sign. Yes, it is a water sign, so it is about kind of delving in deep with things and tapping into that intuition. Um, but Scorpio is very kind of militaristic. It's a fighting energy, right? Because it's ruled by Mars. So it's kind of the by far the most masculine of the water signs. It's a very masculine sign, even though technically it's a yin sign. So again, there's kind of a contradiction with Scorpio. There's a contradiction with these placements. Um, it's like this state doesn't know exactly who it is, and I can definitely see here too that this would captivate a lot of attention. Any kind of placements that are either exalted or debilitated, or in domicile or detriment, they always gain a lot of attention. Hold on, let me turn my AC off so it's quiet for you. All right, that was mostly for I love maths because you complained. So I'll always keep the AC off when I do my videos now. But yeah, I can see a lot of contradictions with this state, especially with how it's perceived. So yeah, definitely looking at Moon and Venus on the ascendant, that's a huge source of this kind of contradiction or misconceptions. On the one hand, this is a state that is disconnected from its own femininity. It's focusing on a survival mentality and having to work very hard and analyze everything. Scorpio is a very vigilant sign. It's the most kind of um, what's the word? I think I just used this word. It's the most hyper aware. It's in a survival mode. The survival mode makes that hyper awareness with Scorpio. This is like mid fall energy with when everything appears to be dying. So if you can imagine like that time of year, we our senses are heightened because of that kind of like death component. And it's a statistical thing as well. Like when things get colder, when the temperature gets colder, it kind of just makes us more aware. Everything's more crisp, right? Like we can be so analytical, we can be so deep feeling and intuitive, and we tend to be more like socially aware, and it can be romantic or sexual as well. So all of that is kind of something I would expect. All those attitudes and vibes and energies I'd expect from this kind of state, from this culture in general, with these very intense Scorpio placements conjunct the ascendant. So there's this hyper awareness and this like vigilant attitude and like having to fight for survival. But then there's also this like hedonism and wealth and, making appearances and being feminine. So it's kind of contradictory. Which one is it? Do you want me to be, tap into my feminine side and surrender and be very receptive and spiritual? Or or do you want me to, like, I'm kind of picturing, I don't know if you follow tarot. I've been getting into tarot lately, but I'm picturing, like I said, on the one hand this is like high priestess energy, but on the other hand this is also kind of like knight of wands energy. Do you want me to like fight for survival and constantly be fighting and be very ambitious and challenging everything, or do you want me to do the opposite and kind of surrender with nature, go with the flow, and tap into these like seductive and powerful, maybe more kind of like non-physical energies? Both are true with this state, and I think that can be confusing. Another thing that, if you are aware of astrology, you've probably seen in the chart by now, is that there are some intense aspects here. There aren't a ton of aspects because most of the planets are in Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio in the 11th and 12th houses. So those planets aren't necessarily aspecting one another a whole lot. However, there is this kind of cluster, this sort of, I would say, troublesome cluster of outer planets in uh, the last half of Aries, and these planets are making some intense aspects. So we've got Saturn at 19 Aries. Oh, that means that California is about to have its Saturn return. I don't know how many Saturn returns it's been. I'm not going to do the math right now, but so that suggests that the next 2 or 3 years in particular may be very challenging for California, and there may be some intense Intense events. These events may have to do with breakdowns of authority figures or politicians, as well as like economic issues as well. I would especially expect that since this is a state we're talking about. That's what a Saturn return kind of makes me think of. Sorry, there's a hair on my microphone, so I blew it away. Anyway, so there's that Saturn return. Not only that, but after the Saturn return, the natal Saturn will cross over the Pluto-Uranus conjunction before transiting Saturn enters Taurus, if that makes sense. I don't know if I said that right. Forgive me if I misspoke, but basically what we're experiencing is transiting Saturn, crossing over California's natal Saturn, as well as its Pluto and Uranus in the next 3 years or so. This looks very intense, but keep in mind that this is not the first, second, or third time that this has happened in California's history. This is a very intense thing that happens about every, let's just say 30 years, or between, 28 and 30 years. Every time Saturn goes through the end of Aries, it looks like California is going to have a very difficult time. So it's 2025 now. So what was happening 29, 30 years ago? So that would be 1995, 1996. Maybe some of you are more familiar with California's history than I am. I would speculate that in the mid to late 90s, there may have been some very intense events going on with California. Anyway, but this is a really intense natal configuration. Not only because we have this group of, I want to say malefics, like Saturn and Pluto are definitely malefics. Uranus is technically not a malefic. I think it's more of a neutral energy. But Uranus is a disruptor, and I was just talking with someone recently about how in some ways Uranus can kind of act like Jupiter, where Uranus can kind of expand and kind of blow things up, right? It can kind of dramatize other aspects or planets or what have you. So I think that's a great example here with Uranus pretty tightly conjunct Pluto. This means that California was formed at a time where things were changing really dramatically with that Uranus-Pluto conjunction. That's a very rare conjunction, and especially because Saturn was approaching those planets as well. Yes, all three of them are retrograde, but in a longer term sense, Saturn was about to pass over Pluto and Uranus. So they're all like, if you apply a wide enough orb, you can say they're loosely conjunct at the end of Aries. This is also particularly intense because Pluto and Uranus are at the last degree of Aries. So basically what this means is California California was formed at a time where things were dramatically changing and there was a lot of intense pressure. And so, just like with any other chart, California kind of encapsulates that intensity that it was sort of born under, if that makes sense. That intensity will always be there. And I think in a weird way, this kind of reminds me of America's chart because both were formed at very intense times where things were dramatically changing. And so as an entity, California, much like the US, will constantly embody this energy of, rebellion and transformation and, pushing the boundaries and, for better or for worse. I think that just kind of creates an extreme character in general. So anyway, I've really rambled on a lot about this. It is a very interesting configuration. And I think I mentioned in passing that Uranus and Pluto at the last degree of Aries, last degree of any sign, is very intense. So again, it just kind of intensifies the chart. It means this is an intense place to live, and probably always has been in one way or another. But I've talked so much about this configuration, and I haven't even mentioned yet that Uranus and Pluto, and to a lesser extent Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn are all opposing planets in Libra, and they're making out of sign oppositions is the technical term to the moon and the ascendant, if that makes sense. So in other words, Uranus and Pluto are conjunct the descendant more or less, even though they're in slightly different signs. Descendant is at the very beginning of Taurus. Pluto and Uranus are at the very end of Aries, generally speaking. And this intensifies this configuration even more because anytime you have planets on one of the angles, it intensifies things. And at this point, you may notice that this isn't the first time we've identified a planet conjunct one of the angles in this chart. We talked a lot about Moon and Venus conjunct the ascendant. The ascendant is probably the most intense angle to have planets conjunct on. But now we're also seeing Uranus and Pluto conjunct the descendant, which is even more intense because they're opposing Venus and the Moon. Uh, but then even Saturn, although it's not exactly conjunct the descendant, Saturn is 6 degrees away from opposing Mercury. So, and oppositions in general are very intense. Oppositions can be fruitful, I guess you could say, like very productive. There can be drama, action. There can be, I don't know, really dramatic action, basically, if that makes sense. Like if you want to really get stuff done, an opposition can help you do that. It can be decisive and action oriented. On the other hand, it can also create like gridlock. It can create intensity and kind of strife and opposition. You're kind of opposing yourself. Like Californians, different types of Californians may be opposing each other. They may be fighting with each other. Um, you know, or in other words, a chart like this suggests that within this entity, there's these different factions kind of fighting against each other. As a state, this region has different energies or different needs, and it may be very difficult at times to balance those needs. How can you be Libra and early Scorpio, but then also balance that with late Aries? These energies are not compatible, so that's difficult. It can be, well, especially when I look at like natal charts for humans, for people. I think dynamics like these can work to someone's favor with time. I think it takes a lot of maturity to know how to balance these energies, and then once you do learn that, you can become very well rounded, and that can be a strength. But I think it takes a lot of time to develop that strength and to know how to do that. I think early on, this tends to make a person or an entity extreme, dramatic, volatile. They may swing, the pendulum may swing back and forth because that's the only way they know how to like satisfy these very different needs, is just doing it one at a time, since the needs are incompatible. So again, maybe that kind of explains part of why California has such different periods of history. It's like, which way do I want to go? Do I want to be this intense transformer, or do I want peace and go with the Libra placements, or do I want this like feminine Moon Venus side and be very intuitive and artistic, or do I want to be intense and powerful like Scorpio? It's trying to do all these different things, and maybe sometimes being really good at one of those, but then quickly like fleeting away from one and then moving to the other. And I think that's it suggests to me that it would create a lot of instability. I want to go back though to a point that I was saying earlier about planets on the angles, or planets, or I guess I should say points, major points or placements on the angles as well, because Lilith, although it's not a planet, it is pretty tightly conjunct the IC, and we also have the nodes pretty close to the IC midheaven axis as well. So South Node is pretty close to Lilith and the IC. So that's pretty wild. Let's just focus on that for a moment. So we have not one, not two, but you could say three different triple conjunctions involving some of the major angles. I know the South Node isn't notated on these astro theme charts, but it's pretty easy to figure out where the South Node is. North Node is at 14 degrees Leo in the 10th house, therefore South Node must be at 14 degrees Aquarius in the 4th house. So pretty tightly conjunct Lilith, and to a lesser extent kind of conjunct the IC as well. So the fact that you have two planets conjunct the ascendant, two planets conjunct the descendant, and then two placements conjunct the IC, that's a pretty big deal. I think this is a like, I don't know if there was any astrologer involved in the determining this time, or maybe it was just destiny, but this definitely looks like a very extreme chart to me. If this was a chart of a person, I would think it was a celebrity, because many celebrities have placements in the 10th, 11th, and sometimes 12th houses, or also especially placements conjunct the angles, especially the midheaven or ascendant. So this, in other words, this chart to me, even if I didn't know what the chart was for, if I didn't know it was for California, or if it was for a person or what have you, I would know this is an extreme chart. This is a chart of something like whoever or whatever this is going to turn heads, and they're going to maybe change history, or they're going to be very extreme, right? Because of multiple things, because of planets high in the sky, planets rising above the eastern horizon at this time, but also the planets on the angles as well. That shows a lot of extremeness. That shows intensity. And that's why I find it so interesting to do the charts of like celebrities, for example, because there's always something, weird or interesting or extreme about them. And that's why they're celebrities. There's something notable. There's always something, interesting going on in the charts. Anyway, but looking at Lilith and South Node conjunct the IC, this shows that there's a lot going on beneath the surface. Yes, there's also a lot going on above the surface as well. But Scorpio rising, I often find the rising sign tends to kind of encapsulate the entire chart, if that makes sense. So with Scorpio rising, Scorpio is a very dynamic sign. I mentioned earlier how Scorpio is it can be, well, it's technically a yin sign, which is receptive. Water is kind of the most receptive element, but Scorpio is ruled by Mars, so it's very masculine, very warlike. So it's kind of, it's kind of both. It's dynamic in a way. Scorpio is also probably overall an emotional or intuitive sign, but it can also be extremely analytical, detail oriented, very mental and logical as well. So again, very dynamic. Scorpio can be very physically oriented and physically active, but it can also be very artistic or intellectual. Like it can do anything because of that hyper awareness that it has. It's got the reflexes, like anything that you need to survive. Scorpio's pretty much got it, right? So the fact that California has that on its rising sign to me suggests that it's a very dynamic state. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of economic potential. Like this state knows how to survive. At the same time, though, with Scorpio placements in general, there can be a lot of paranoia and there can be this kind of destruction from within. So in other words, like Scorpio's got that shell, like it's the scorpion, right? So it's got the pinchers, it's got the tail with the venom. Like it's kind of like a tank. Like it's just got weapons all around it. It's got the shell. It's built to survive. The only weakness is from within. So do with that what you will. But anyway, the reason why I started talking about that is because the Scorpio rising, I feel like makes so much sense when we look at the IC and Lilith and the South Node conjunct the IC. This means that, like, if this state were a person, I would say that in its past life, it wasn't reputable, it wasn't well known. So in this state's kind of like lineage, so to speak, if estates have that, I would suggest that this kind of fame and notoriety is new for this energy, if that makes sense. In its sort of past life, so to speak, or maybe just starting out after statehood, this state may have been kind of an outcast. That's what I see in Aquarius would suggest. And especially conjunct Lilith and the South Node, it may have taken a lot of time. And I believe, from what I know, like I said, I do think it did take a lot of time for this state to gain that kind of notoriety and publicity. It would start out as a nobody, with IC in Aquarius and South Node in Aquarius. Kind of an outsider, a nobody. But there was always something special about it, though. Something was actually just thinking about the other day. Anytime I see South Node or North Node or IC or Midheaven in Aquarius or Leo, so I know that sounds complicated, but basically the nodal axis or the IC Midheaven axis, anytime those are in Aquarius and Leo, it suggests a person who is simultaneously an outcast, but someone who also gets a lot of fame and recognition and attention, and they're either an outcast and they're kind of made fun of, and or they are praised and they are very famous and they're celebrated, or often it's kind of a combination of the two. Oftentimes the people that are most celebrated and that have the highest kind of publicity, in a weird way, it can be very isolating, because by having a strong kind of shallow relationship with everyone, you're sacrificing the ability to have close, intimate relationships with, like, it's kind of like quantity over quality, if that makes sense. And I see that in the charts. So in other words, like, just to go off on this tangent a little bit more, technically it's not really a tangent because this is very relevant to this chart's themes, but anyone who has like a lot of midheaven energy, for example, like, yeah, everyone's going to know them and they're going to be praised and whatnot, they're going to have a really strong reputation, but usually the family life is lacking, maybe just because they're spending more time in the public, or also just, if you're famous, how do you have like an intimate conversation? How can you actually everyone thinks that they already know you from this kind of shallow, like surface level appearance. Um, or same with like, oftentimes authority figures, they have to be the authority, right? They have to be in charge. They can't truly be like intimate and emotionally vulnerable. So, anyway, so that's kind of the dynamic. I know I'm talking a little bit more about this chart as if it were a person, but I do think that can be useful for looking at states. So, in other words, this state was always kind of an outcast. Like, and it kind of makes sense too. If you look at, like I said, when this state first became a state, there wasn't a whole lot going on. It was kind of just, the way, like the outback, so to speak. But then pretty quick, this did become a thing. Resources were found, people started moving to California, and then California did reach statehood in 1850. And at the time, there were no other west. It was the first Western state, basically. There were no other states anywhere near California, only kind of territories. So that makes sense here with the IC in South Node in Aquarius with North Node and Midheaven in Leo. Yes, there's that potential for becoming that kind of Leo character and getting all the attention and coming across a little conceited. But it wouldn't start out that way. It'd start out much more humble, much more kind of alien or outcasted. What's interesting too is Lilith conjunct the IC. That would suggest to me that, especially in the state's early years, but even today, there would be this kind of private or secret hedonism and wildness. Maybe not so secret, right? But maybe we're just saying the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the hedonism that's in California. Lilith conjunct the IC suggests a darkness, um, dark, wild, taboo, sexual. Like all of these are kind of Lilith keywords, and having that energy conjunct the IC, that means it's sort of private, it's hidden, but it's always been there from the very beginning, and maybe even more so. Like it may have been more true to the overall identity in the early years, maybe even more so. Really, I think what California is struggling with is moving away from that hedonism, but at the same time, it's always going to be there because of Moon and Venus conjunct the ascendant. But with South Node conjunct Lilith, it's about how do we get away from that wildness and always being counterculture to everything. How do we move away from that and just become like a true leader? And that's what North Node and 10th House Leo would suggest. Being a leader, being like a leader in the world. They always say California is like, if it were a country, it would be like the fifth largest economy, or I forget what it is exactly, but something like that, right? So there's a lot of power here. How can we use that to be a leader? That's what ideally this state would kind of evolve to do, if that makes sense. So it's got that recognition. I think that would actually be part of this state's kind of evolution. But the question is like, can it be used in a dignified way rather than like secretly using the power or money for hedonism, which is what kind of Lilith on the South Node and the IC would do. Rather than doing that, like, let's be truly transparent. Let's actually be powerful in a truly powerful way, like a true leader, basically. Okay, so I feel like this is getting long. I've been rambling for a while. We talked about the angles. We talked about most of the. Actually, we talked about all the placements other than Neptune, Mars, and Mercury. I really haven't talked a whole lot about. Neptune in the fourth house is interesting. Excuse me. I think it's pretty obvious that there's always been this element of like fantasy and appearances and Hollywood and film. Film. I don't know a lot about the history of television, but I believe it kind of took off in California. That's like, I don't know if it's technically the birthplace, but I think that's the birthplace of the industry as a whole, if that makes sense. So that makes sense with Neptune in Pisces, and it is decently aspected as well. Neptune trines the moon and descendant. So this is not just like some random thing. This is part of this state's identity, which makes a lot of sense. Even Scorpio can be very analytical and precise and very factual, but Scorpio can also be paranoid or delusional, kind of like what we'd associate with Pisces. Both Pisces and Scorpio have to do with fantasy, but also like hidden realities, anything hidden, uncovering things that are hidden or covering up things to make them hidden. either way, Pisces and Scorpio are all about that. And also, I just relate it to like the water element in general. Um, I'm living now near Lake Tahoe, which is part of why I'm doing this reading. But especially when the water's very clear and like when you can see very well underwater, it's very what's the word, like not debilitating. It's very misleading. It's very confusing because the depth perception is completely different underwater. Things become distorted, right? So I think that's true with any water sign. Even Scorpio, which likes to be very precise, can be very subjective, and things can become distorted. It can become afraid of small things, or really excited about small, like things in general can become distorted. So anyway, so there's definitely this element of fantasy there. So maybe that's kind of beginning to explain why this doesn't seem like a Virgo planet, or excuse me, a Virgo state. Another part of this is because this chart lacks Earth. Um, yes, Sun is in Virgo, Jupiter's in Virgo. It's not happy about it. I would say Sun is not that happy in Virgo either. Virgo's the last sign of summer, and it's the sign that leads to the fall equinox, which starts Libra, where Sun is in fall. So Virgo is kind of like it's like paving the way for the Sun to reach its demise, if that makes sense. It's the last sign that has more daylight than darkness before the fall equinox, at least in the northern hemisphere. So Sun, I don't think Sun is too stoked to be in Virgo. It's kind of like the last hurrah before before Sun goes into the underworld and we have 6 months of darkness, right? So anyway, so the only Earth planets that are here are not strong. They're, yes, they are in the 11th house, so that's really great, but they're in a sign that they're unhappy with. So it kind of makes sense that this state wouldn't come across like Earth or like Virgo. Um, there's more going on in Libra, I would say, even though Mars is in detriment, so that's a little weird too. I would say the water would stand out, and even the fire, even though there aren't a lot of fire planets, having midheaven in Leo is a pretty big deal, especially with the North Node conjunct midheaven. Um, but then Venus, Moon, and the Ascendant in Scorpio, I think that's what would really stand out is Scorpio and maybe Leo as well. So I would characterize the state as kind of Scorpio and Leo um, at the forefront. And then once you kind of look at it a little bit more, then you'd see Pisces, you'd see maybe Virgo and Libra. Um, but yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag, which again, that's kind of what I expected. But it is a very dynamic chart, very interesting. There's definitely layers to it. Okay, we talked about Neptune. Let's talk about Mercury and Mars. So this is a pretty interesting conjunction. Mercury does pretty well in Libra. It's a very analytical sign. So this shows there's a lot of intelligence here. There's a lot of intellect, and there's a lot of mental prowess. Maybe, technology, for instance, with Sun and Virgo and Mercury and Libra. These could be like, I would expect maybe a technological industry in California, which I guess now that I think about it, yeah, we do definitely see that with California. Even Scorpio, to a more or less extent, could kind of support that as well. Um, but what's interesting is Mercury and Mars are in the 12th house. Technically, Venus and the Moon are in the 12th house as well. I believe it's either Placis or equal houses. Um, this is with Placis. I usually use equal houses. This is technically Placidus. It's far enough south that the houses are more or less equal. Anyway, but with all these planets in the 12th house, I would say is probably the most difficult house to have planets in. It's a little different with the moon is so tightly conjunct the ascendant that it's, I think, strengthened much more. Even Venus, to a slightly lesser extent, is conjunct the ascendant, so they are kind of strong there. But Mercury and Mars, which are much farther up the 12th house, these are challenged and they may be kind of secret, especially Mars. Mars being in detriment and in the 12th house in Libra. That would suggest that this state does not come across like a fighter. It does and it doesn't. Again, here's a contradiction because with all the Scorpio placements, we would suggest a fighter. But the chart ruler is Mars in 12th house Libra, which is not a fighter at all. if it does fight, it does so secretly and subtly, and this would be a state that fights in a very low energy type of way. So rather than like um, asserting its power very directly and saying, "Hey, I'm in charge, and you have to do what I say," and we have like a strong military or something like that. Rather than having that approach, it's going to be much more secretive. So I would expect like manipulation and control through either wealth and finances and different kind of subtle policies that would affect those things, or even like mental control, mind control. Literally, Libra 12th house, Mercury conjunct Mars. That to me suggests mind control, right? Like if you know astrology, I feel like you'll see where I'm coming from. Um, Mind control, manipulation, maybe manipulation of currency, but especially mind control though. That's honestly the main thing that stands out to me, especially if you have Moon and Venus conjunct the ascendant in Scorpio, being trined by Neptune and Pisces, and you factor in Mercury and Mars conjunct in 12th house Libra. All of that looks to me like mind control, like having this really like grandiose, like really opulent, like beautiful, um, like entertainment industry or television. But then, and part of that would be genuine, but part of it would be dramatically distorted as well. And then, that could be used in part for like mental manipulation or mind control. There could be other methods of control behind the scenes as well. But just think about like if you wanted to assert your power onto somebody, but with exerting as little energy, as little physical energy as possible, you're going to use your charm, you're going to use your intelligence. What else? Manipulation. There's probably other things that I'm not thinking of right now. But, this is kind of like Venus energy again. And we're coming back to Venus, which is on the ascendant. Um, what else was I gonna say? Yeah, it's very strange. There's this weird combination of coming across like very innocent and receptive and feminine, but at the same time there's this like wildness and this paranoia and this need to dominate, but dominating in a subtle way. I'm almost picturing like some kind of like stepmother character. You know how there's always like the evil stepmother in like fairy tales or whatever. I'm almost picturing like a modern version of that, like a stepmom that seems super nice at first and so pleasant and like very like traditionally feminine, but then she's completely manipulative. Like she has this agenda. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the energy that I'm imagining here. Anyway, I might wrap it up there. I feel like I'm kind of suddenly done. Oh, one last thing though. With detriment energies in general, I mentioned this earlier. I'm noticing a lot of detriment energies here, detriment planets or fall planets. And I mentioned this earlier, like anytime energies are debilitated, they can get stronger over time. But there's also an element of, I like to say, being outside of the box. So debilitated placements mean that you're going to be more original. You can come up with your own ideas. So for instance, with California, new technologies, new policies, being very progressive, being very cutting edge. That makes sense with these debilitated placements. The state is always going to do its own thing, for better or for worse. But also part of being outside of the box is being rebellious, being counterculture. I guess that I was kind of said that already. Counterculture, rebellious, provocative. Saying I don't care what everyone else is doing. I'm going to do my own thing. And I think that approach has pros and cons. You're excuse me, you're like completely abandoning any kind of tradition, and I think tradition in itself can be good and it can be bad. You may be abandoning traditional wisdom or convention, common sense, or like knowledge that's been established over a great amount of time could be completely lost with an energy like this. But on the other hand, you could also have revolution and discovering new ways of being. But I think it's very risky, very radical, and there's good and bad. There's good that's lost from ditching tradition, but there's also bad that's lost, if that makes sense. That it's I don't know. It's just a different way of doing things. Um, and then last thing I'll kind of say oh, actually, I'm so scatterbrained. So speaking about these debilitated placements, I wanted to just do a run through real quick. So Saturn is actually in fall in Aries. I didn't talk much about that. Moon is in fall in Taurus. Venus is in detriment, or excuse me, Moon is in fall in Scorpio. Venus is in detriment in Scorpio. Mars is in detriment in Libra, and Jupiter is in detriment in Virgo. Lots of detriment placements, and especially when you combine that with IC and South Node and Aquarius, this is a state that came from nothing. That's what I would speculate. Like, and I'm not, don't take that the wrong way. Obviously there's a very rich like native history there. I don't think there was a huge native population. There definitely were natives, don't get me wrong. There's definitely a culture there. But population wise, like if you actually look at the numbers, I don't think there was a huge population living in this area because it was mostly dry. There wasn't, a lot there, if that makes sense. That's what I was trying to say. And then even in the kind of like European exploration and American exploration, the state kind of started from nothing, if that makes sense. But then it became this like grandiose thing. But it's always been an outsider. It's always been counterculture, and probably always will be as long as it's a state. Um, so anyway, that's my take on California's chart. Let me know if you like this style of video, and I have covered a couple other like countries and states and things like that, or cities. But let me know if there are any cities, states, or countries that you'd like me to cover the charts of, or if you have any other requests at all. I'm also offering birth chart readings, so it would be a little bit like this, but a little bit more structured. My paid birth chart readings are, I like to structure them, and they're usually about an hour long. Anyway, if you're interested in that, check out my website. My information is always in the description, or you can also email me if you'd like. But anyway, thanks so much for listening to this. Hope you relate to this or find it interesting. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Have a great day.